The morning sun had barely touched the stone walls of Windsor Castle when the shouting began. Oliver. Marsh stood frozen at his post, his red uniform stiff against his chest, his bearskin hat heavy on his head. He was 19 years old. This was only his 4th week as a Kingsguard, and right now, Queen Camilla was standing 3 feet away from him, her face tight with anger. "Are you listening to me?" she snapped. Oliver's throat went dry, stared straight ahead, just like he'd been trained. Guards don't move. Guards don't speak. Guards are statues. But his hands were shaking. "I asked you a question," Camilla said, stepping closer. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Who gave you permission to let that photographer stand there?" Oliver didn't know what she was talking about. A photographer? He hadn't seen anyone. He'd been standing at his post for 2 hours, watching the courtyard, doing exactly what he was told. "Your Majesty, I don't interrupt me." The words hit him like a slap. His heart pounded so hard he thought everyone could hear it. A few tourists had stopped nearby, phones out, filming. Oliver could feel their eyes on him. He could feel the heat crawling up his neck. And if you're watching this right now, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Camilla leaned in, her tone ice cold. "This is unacceptable. It will be reported. Do you understand?" Oliver's jaw tightened. His eyes burned, but he didn't blink. He didn't dare. Then from across the courtyard a voice rang out. "Camilla." It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Everyone turned. King Charles was walking toward them, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression calm but firm. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man who knew the weight of every step he took. Camilla straightened. "Charles, this guard I know," he said quietly. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze moving from Camilla to Oliver. For a moment, the young guard felt his stomach drop. Was the king angry too? But Charles didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful. "Tell me," Charles said, still looking at Oliver. "How long have you been standing here this morning?" Oliver's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He wasn't sure if he was allowed to answer. "You may speak," Charles said gently. 2 hours, Your Majesty," Oliver managed. His voice cracked slightly. Charles nodded. "And did you see a photographer in the restricted area?" "No, sir, I didn't." Camilla let out a sharp breath. "Charles," someone was clearly then perhaps. Charles interrupted, his tone still calm. "The fault does not lie with this young man." The courtyard went silent. Camilla blinked. "What?" Charles turned to face her fully now. His voice was soft, but there was steel underneath. "He's 19 years old, Camilla. He's doing his duty, and he's doing it well." Oliver felt something break loose in his chest. Relief? Gratitude? He wasn't sure, but his eyes stung, and he had to force himself to keep staring straight ahead. Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line. "I see." "Good," Charles said. Then he turned back to Oliver. "Carry on, guardsman." "Yes, Your Majesty." Charles gave him the smallest nod. Then he walked away, his footsteps echoing across the stone courtyard. Camilla stood there for a moment longer, her face unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and left. Oliver exhaled, his breath shaking. But the story was far from over. Asterisk by noon. The entire castle was talking about it. Oliver heard the whispers as he stood at his post near the east gate. Guards weren't supposed to gossip. But news traveled fast in a place like this. Everyone had seen what happened, or heard about it, or seen the videos online. "Did you see the way the king stepped in?" One of the staff members murmured as she passed, stood up for him right in front of her. Another voice said Oliver kept his eyes forward, but his mind was racing. He didn't feel like a hero, felt like a target. When his shift finally ended, he walked back to the guardhouse with his head down. His legs ached. His shoulders were stiff. But worse than the physical pain was the weight pressing down on his chest. Inside the guardhouse, the other guards were waiting. "Marsh." One of them called out. His name was Daniels, an older guard with a scar above his left eye. "You're famous, mate." Oliver pulled off his bearskin hat and set it down carefully. "I don't want to be famous." "Too late for that," another guard said, grinning. "You're all over social media. King defends young guard. People are eating it up." Oliver sank onto the bench and buried his face in his hands. I didn't do anything, Gackley Daniels said, his tone more serious now. You didn't do anything wrong, and the king made sure everyone knew it. But that wasn't what worried Oliver. What worried him was what would happen next. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Oliver was summoned to the officers' quarters. His stomach twisted into knots as he walked down the narrow hallway. He'd been a guard for less than a month. He'd never been summoned anywhere before. The officer, a stern man named Captain Reynolds, was sitting behind a heavy wooden desk. He didn't smile when Oliver entered. "Sit," Reynolds said. Oliver sat. Reynolds folded his hands on the desk and studied Oliver for a long moment. "Do you know why you're here?" "Hey. I assume it's about this morning, sir." "It is." Reynolds leaned back in his chair. "What happened out there was unusual." Oliver nodded, unsure of what to say. "The Queen Consort was upset," Reynolds continued. "She believed a security breach had occurred. She was doing what she thought was right." "Yes, sir." "And His Majesty," Reynolds said slowly, "intervened on your behalf?" Oliver swallowed. "Yes, sir." Reynolds was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you understand what that means?" Oliver shook his head. "It means," Reynolds said, "that you have the king's attention. And attention from the crown is a double-edged sword, Marsh. It can protect you, or it can destroy you." The words sent a chill down Oliver's spine. "I don't want any trouble, sir," Oliver said quietly. "I just want to do my job." "I believe you," Reynolds said. "But you need to understand something. There are people in this castle who don't take kindly to disruptions. And what happened this morning was a disruption." Oliver's throat tightened. "What should I do?" Reynolds stood and walked to the window, his back to Oliver. "Keep your head down. Do your duty. And for God's sake, stay out of the Queen Consort's way." "Yes, sir." Reynolds turned back to face him. Dismissed. Oliver stood, saluted, and left the room. His hands were trembling again. Outside, the castle grounds were dark and quiet. Oliver walked slowly back to the barracks, his mind spinning. He didn't ask for any of this. He didn't want to be in the middle of anything. He just wanted to serve his country, wear the uniform, and make his family proud. But now, everything felt different. As he reached the barracks door, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned quickly. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was one of the palace staff, a woman middle-aged, with kind eyes and a worried expression. "Oliver Marsh?" she asked softly. "Yes." She glanced around as if making sure no one else was listening. Then she leaned in and whispered, "You need to be careful. The Queen Consort doesn't forget." Before Oliver could respond, she turned and disappeared into the night. Oliver stood there, his heart pounding, staring into the darkness. What had he gotten himself into? 3 days passed. Oliver kept his head down, just like Captain Reynolds told him to. He showed up for his shifts on time, stood at his post without moving. He didn't speak unless spoken to, but the tension followed him. Everywhere he could feel it in the way some of the senior staff looked at him. In the way conversations stopped when he walked into a room, in the cold silence that hung in the air whenever he passed certain hallways. On the 4th day, something changed. Oliver was standing guard near the state apartments when he saw her. Queen Camilla. She was walking with 2 advisors, her expression calm, her posture regal. She didn't look in his direction, didn't acknowledge him at all. But as she passed, one of the advisors glanced at Oliver, just for a second. In that glance, Oliver saw something that made his blood run cold. Contempt? He swallowed hard and forced himself to stay still, his pulse hammered in his ears. After they disappeared around the corner, Oliver exhaled slowly. His hands were clammy inside his gloves. That evening, back in the barracks, Daniels pulled him aside. "You look like hell," Daniels said. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." Daniels crossed his arms. "Listen, Marsh. I've been doing this for 12 years. I've seen guards come and go. And I've seen what happens when someone gets caught in the crossfire." Oliver looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Daniels said quietly, "that the people who run this place don't like disruptions. And you, my friend, are a disruption." "I didn't do anything," Oliver said, his voice tight. "I know, but it doesn't matter." Daniels glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Word is, the Queen Consort's people are looking for a reason to get rid of you." Oliver's stomach dropped. "What?" They can't fire you directly, not after the king stepped in, but they can make your life hell until you quit. Oliver felt the walls closing in. So what am I supposed to do? Daniels hesitated. Then he said you could request a transfer, go to another post, another location, get out of the spotlight. Oliver shook his head. I'm not running. Then you'd better be ready for a fight, Daniels said. Because it's coming. That night, Oliver couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in his mind. The confrontation with Camilla, the king's defense, the whispers, the warning from the woman in the shadows. He thought about his mother back home. She'd been so proud when he got accepted into the guard. She'd cried when she saw him in his uniform for the first time. He couldn't quit. Not like this. But he didn't know how to survive this either. The next morning, Oliver was assigned to the West Terrace. It was a quieter post, away from the main courtyard, overlooking the gardens. He was grateful for the solitude. Until he wasn't. Around mid-morning, a palace official approached him. The man was tall, thin, with sharp features and a cold smile. Guardsman Marsh, the man said smoothly. Oliver nodded. Sir, I'm Mr. Whitmore. I work with Her Majesty the Queen Consort. He paused, letting the words sink in. I wanted to have a word with you. Oliver's pulse quickened. Yes, sir. Whitmore stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You've had quite the week, haven't you? I'm just doing my duty, sir, of course. Whitmore smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. However, I feel it's important to remind you that the smooth operation of this household depends on discretion, on discipline, on knowing one's place. Oliver's jaw tightened. I understand, sir. Do you? Whitmore tilted his head. Because from where I stand, it seems you've caused quite a bit of ... disruption. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. Intentions are irrelevant, Whitmore said coldly. What matters is the result. And the result is that you've drawn unwanted attention to yourself. To this institution, Oliver's hands clenched into fists behind his back. Whitmore leaned in, his voice barely audible. Let me be clear, Marsh. His Majesty may have defended you once, but he won't always be there. And when he's not, he let the sentence hang in the air. Then he straightened, his cold smile returning. Have a good day, guardsman. With that, he walked away. Oliver stood there, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. The fight Daniels warned him about? It had just begun. The harassment started small. A shift change that no one told Oliver about. He showed up at the wrong time and got reprimanded in front of the other guards, a uniform inspection where his buttons were deemed unacceptable, even though they looked identical. To everyone else's, a report filed against him for improper posture during a ceremonial event. Oliver had stood perfectly still for 3 hours. But someone had complained anyway. Each incident was minor. Each one was just enough to stay under the radar. But together, they were suffocating. Oliver tried to ignore it. He showed up early. He polished his boots until they gleamed. He checked and rechecked every detail of his uniform. He barely slept. But it wasn't enough 2 weeks after the confrontation with Camilla. Oliver was called into Captain Reynolds' office again. This time, Reynolds didn't tell him to sit. Marsh. Reynolds said, his tone weary. I've received multiple reports about your conduct. Oliver's stomach twisted. Sir, I've been doing everything by the book, I know, Reynolds interrupted. He sighed and rubbed his temples. I know you have. Oliver blinked. Then why? Because it doesn't matter. Reynolds looked up at him, and for the first time, Oliver saw something in the captain's eyes. Pity. You're being pushed out. Marsh, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. But I haven't done anything wrong, I know, Reynolds said quietly. But you're caught in something bigger than you. Bigger than me. Oliver's throat tightened. So what am I supposed to do? Reynolds was silent for a long moment. Then he said, you can resign. Leave with your dignity intact. I'll make sure you get a good reference. And if I don't resign? Reynolds met his eyes. Then they'll find a reason to dismiss you. And it won't be pretty. Oliver felt the floor drop out from under him. This isn't fair. Reynolds agreed. It's not. Oliver left the office in a daze. His legs carried him through the hallways, past the other guards, out into the courtyard. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed air. He ended up near the gardens, sitting on a stone bench, staring at nothing. He thought about quitting, about going home, about telling his mother that he'd failed. The thought made him sick. But what choice did he have? Rough day? Oliver jumped. He turned to see an older man standing a few feet away. The man was dressed in simple work clothes, his hands dirty from gardening. He had kind eyes and a weathered face. "Sorry," the man said with a small smile. "Didn't mean to startle you." Oliver shook his head. "It's fine." The man gestured to the bench. "Mind if I sit?" "Go ahead." He sat in silence for a moment. The man pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his hands. "You're one of the new guards, aren't you?" the man asked. "Yeah," Oliver said quietly. "Tough job," the man said. "I've worked here for 30 years. I've seen a lot of young men in that uniform. Most of them don't last." Oliver looked at him. "Why not?" The man shrugged. "Lots of reasons. The pressure, the scrutiny, the politics." He glanced at Oliver. "Especially the politics." Oliver let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, I'm learning that." The man nodded slowly. "You're the one the king defended, aren't you?" Oliver's chest tightened. "How did you? Everyone knows," the man said gently. "It's a small world in here." Oliver looked down at his hands. "I wish he hadn't." "Why?" "Because now I'm a target," Oliver said, his voice breaking slightly. "I just wanted to do my job. I didn't ask for any of this." The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I tell you something?" Oliver nodded. 30 years ago, I made a mistake. A bad one. I was young, careless, and I thought my career was over." The man paused. "But someone stood up for me. Someone important. And because of that, I got a second chance." Oliver looked at him. "Who stood up for you?" The man smiled. "The king, back when he was still the Prince of Wales." Oliver's eyes widened. "He didn't have to," the man continued. "But he did. And you know why?" "Why?" "Because he believes in fairness," the man said. "He believes in protecting people who can't protect themselves. That's who he is." Oliver felt something stir in his chest. Hope, maybe, or just the faintest ember of it. "So my advice?" the man said, standing up. "Don't quit. Not yet. Not when someone like that is in your corner." Before Oliver could respond, the man tipped his cap and walked away, disappearing into the gardens. Oliver sat there, staring after him, and for the first time in 2 weeks, he didn't feel completely alone. Oliver didn't quit. Instead, he doubled down. He showed up earlier than required. He stayed later. He perfected every detail of his duties. He refused to give them a single reason to dismiss him. But the pressure kept building. The reports kept coming. The complaints kept piling up. And Oliver could feel himself cracking under the weight of it all. 3 weeks after the confrontation, he was assigned to stand guard during a formal state dinner. It was a high-profile event with dignitaries from around the world. The kind of assignment that usually went to experienced guards. Oliver should have been honored, instead. He was terrified. He knew why they'd chosen him. They were hoping he'd mess up. One mistake in front of all those people, and it would be over. The evening of the dinner, Oliver stood in the grand hallway. His uniform immaculate, his posture rigid. Guests streamed past him in elegant gowns and tuxedos. Chandeliers glittered overhead. Somewhere in the distance, an orchestra played. Oliver kept his eyes forward and tried to ignore the knot in his stomach. Then he saw them. King Charles and Queen Camilla, walking side by side, greeting guests. Charles looked calm and dignified, as always. Camilla's expression was pleasant, polished, unreadable. As they passed Oliver, Charles glanced in his direction. Their eyes met for just a fraction of a second, and the king gave him the smallest nod. It was so quick, so subtle, that Oliver almost thought he'd imagined it. But the warmth in that brief acknowledgement steadied him, gave him strength. He stood a little taller. The dinner went on for hours. Oliver's legs ached. His back burned. But he didn't move, didn't falter. And when the last guest finally left, he allowed himself to exhale. He'd made it through. The next morning, Oliver was cleaning his uniform when Daniels burst into the barracks. "Marsh, you need to see this." "See what?" Daniels shoved his phone in Oliver's face. On the screen was a news article. The headline read, "King Charles' Quiet Act of Kindness, Defending the Guards Who Serve Him." Oliver's heart skipped. "What is this?" "Someone leaked the story," Daniels said, his eyes wide. "The whole thing. The confrontation. The king stepping in. It's everywhere." Oliver grabbed the phone and scrolled through the article. It described the incident in detail, praised Charles for his compassion, criticized the culture of intimidation within the palace. "Oh no," Oliver whispered. "Oh no is right," Daniels said. "This is going to explode." And it did. By noon, the story had gone viral. Social media was flooded with comments supporting Oliver and praising the king. News outlets were running segments on it. Palace officials were scrambling to control the narrative. Oliver felt like he was drowning that afternoon. He was summoned again. But this time, it wasn't Captain Reynolds' office. It was the king's private study. Oliver's hands shook as he walked through the palace corridors, accompanied by a stone-faced aide. He'd never been to this part of the castle before. The walls were lined with portraits of monarchs past. The air smelled of old wood and history. The aide stopped in front of a heavy oak door and knocked twice. "Enter," came a voice from inside. The aide opened the door and gestured for Oliver to go in. Oliver stepped inside, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. King Charles was standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the gardens. He didn't turn when Oliver entered. "Close the door," Charles said quietly. Oliver did. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Then Charles turned to face him. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair near the fireplace. Oliver sat, his back ramrod straight, his hands gripping his knees. Charles walked over and sat across from him. Up close, the king looked tired. There were lines around his eyes that Oliver hadn't noticed before. "Do you know why you're here?" Charles asked. "I assume it's about the article, Your Majesty." Charles nodded slowly. "It is." He paused. "Tell me, Oliver, did you speak to the press?" "No, sir," Oliver said quickly. "I swear I didn't." Charles studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you." Oliver felt a wave of relief. "But the story is out there now," Charles continued, "and it's caused quite a stir." "I'm sorry, Your Majesty." "I never wanted—" "Don't apologize," Charles interrupted gently. "You've done nothing wrong," Oliver blinked. "I haven't." Charles leaned back in his chair. "No. In fact, you've done everything right. You've shown courage, integrity, and resilience in the face of unjust treatment." Oliver's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. "I know what's been happening to you," Charles said quietly. "The reports, the complaints, the attempts to push you out." Oliver's eyes widened. "You do?" "Yes." Charles' expression hardened. "And it's unacceptable." For the first time in weeks, Oliver felt something other than fear. He felt hope. "What happens now?" Oliver asked quietly. Charles looked at him, his gaze steady and kind. "Now," the king said, "we make sure it never happens again." The changes happened quickly. Within days, a palace statement was released. It didn't mention Oliver by name, but it didn't have to. The statement emphasized the king's commitment to fairness, dignity, and the well-being of all palace staff and guards. It announced a review of workplace conduct policies. The message was clear. Things were going to be different. Oliver felt the shift immediately. The hostile glances stopped. The petty complaints disappeared. Staff members who had once avoided him now nodded politely when they passed. Captain Reynolds called him into his office one more time. "Marsh," Reynolds said, and this time there was warmth in his voice. "I owe you an apology." Oliver shook his head. "You don't, sir. You were just—" "I should have fought harder for you," Reynolds interrupted. "I knew what was happening. And I let it continue because I thought it was easier to let you go than to challenge the system. He met Oliver's eyes. I was wrong. Oliver didn't know what to say. You've got a future here if you want it, Reynolds continued, and I'll make sure you're treated fairly. You have my word. Thank you, sir, Oliver said quietly as he left the office. Oliver felt lighter than he had in weeks, but there was still one person he hadn't faced. 2 days later, during a ceremonial event in the courtyard, Oliver saw Queen Camilla again. She was standing near the king, elegant and composed. Watching the proceedings, Oliver stood at his post, trying not to let his nerves show. When the ceremony ended, the king and queen began to walk past the line of guards, as was tradition. Oliver's pulse quickened as they approached. Charles stopped in front of him. "Guardsman Marsh," the king said warmly. "Your Majesty," Oliver replied, his voice steady. Charles smiled. "Well done today, thank you, sir." Then, to Oliver's surprise, Camilla stepped forward. Her expression was neutral, but there was something different in her eyes. Something that might have been respect, or perhaps just acknowledgement. "Guardsman," she said with a slight nod. "Your Majesty," Oliver replied. She didn't apologize, didn't explain. But the nod was enough. It was a truce. They moved on. And Oliver exhaled slowly. It was over that evening. Oliver walked through the palace grounds as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the anger, the moments when he'd wanted to give up, but he hadn't. And now, standing here in his uniform, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. He thought about the gardener's words, about the king's quiet acts of kindness, about the way one person's courage could change everything. Oliver didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going anywhere. A few days later, Oliver received an unexpected summons. Not to an office or a formal meeting, but to the gardens. The same gardens where he'd met the old gardener. When he arrived, King Charles was there, alone, inspecting a rose bush. "Your Majesty," Oliver said. Surprised, Charles looked up and smiled. "Oliver, thank you for coming, of course, sir." Charles straightened and brushed the dirt from his hands. "I wanted to speak with you, away from the formality of the palace." Oliver nodded, unsure of what to say. "You've been through a difficult time," Charles said, "and I wanted you to know that what you did, standing your ground, refusing to be intimidated, took real courage." "I just did my duty, sir." "Oh, you did more than that? You reminded everyone here what integrity looks like." Oliver felt his throat tighten. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Charles looked at him thoughtfully. The role of a king's guard is not just to stand still and look dignified. It's to represent the values this institution is supposed to uphold. Fairness, honor, compassion. He paused. "You've embodied those values, Oliver. And that matters more than any ceremony or tradition." Oliver didn't trust himself to speak. He simply nodded. "I also wanted to tell you something," Charles continued. "That day in the courtyard, when I defended you, it wasn't a difficult decision. It was the easiest decision I've made in a long time." "Why, sir?" Charles smiled. "Because standing up for what's right is never complicated. It's just necessary." They stood there for a moment, two men from entirely different worlds, connected by a shared understanding. Then Charles extended his hand. Oliver shook it, and the king's grip was firm and warm. "Carry on, Oliver," Charles said, "and know that you have my respect." "Thank you, Your Majesty. That means everything." Charles nodded and turned back to his roses, leaving Oliver standing in the fading light. As Oliver walked back toward the palace, he felt something shift inside him. Not just relief or gratitude, but a deeper sense of purpose. He'd learned something in these past weeks. That courage wasn't about never being afraid. It was about standing firm, even when you were terrified. That integrity meant doing the right thing even when the cost was high. And that sometimes, in the darkest moments, a single act of kindness could change everything. Oliver Marsh went on to serve as a king's guard for many years. He became known not just for his discipline or his appearance, but for his character. Young guards looked up to him. Officers respected him. And whenever anyone asked him about that day in the courtyard, he always said the same thing. The king taught me that real strength isn't about power. It's about using whatever power you have to protect those who can't protect themselves. And in a world that often felt cold and uncaring, that lesson echoed far beyond the stone walls of Windsor Castle. It echoed in every heart that heard the story, in every person who chose to stand up when it would have been easier to stay silent, in every act of kindness, no matter how small, because in the end, that's what mattered most. Not titles or crowns or ceremonies, but the courage to do what's right and the grace to defend those who need it most.